Well, hello, my name's Evan Reese, and on behalf of the U.S. Resiliency Council and our series sponsor, Optimum Seismic, welcome to this sixth program in the Resilience Advantage webinar series. We really hope you've enjoyed our previous webinars. Today, we're looking at another important subject, green and resilient design, a new model for sustainability. We'll examine how both green design, where we have a low impact on the environment, and resilient design, where the environment has a low impact on us, are necessary in order to be truly sustainable. By protecting our existing building infrastructure and making sure our new buildings are built for the long term, we make our communities more resilient and more sustainable in the face of the impacts of climate change and other natural perils. The U.S. Resiliency Council is a nonprofit. We were founded 11 years ago, working to improve community resilience one building at a time. We use building performance rating systems, educational programs such as the Resilience Advantage, and coalition building with key stakeholders to make our built environment, which are your buildings, your homes, office places, more sustainable, prosperous, and resilient. This series would not be possible without the sponsorship of Optimum Seismic, and I want to take this opportunity to thank Ali Sahabi and all of his group at Optimum Seismic for not only their sponsorship of the Resilience Advantage webinar series, but really all of the work that they've done over the past decades in retrofitting existing buildings, making them not only safer, but more sustainable. And so we really appreciate that. Our two champions today for this episode are the U.S. Green Buildings Council Los Angeles, and you'll hear from BenStapleton both in the video and he is on our panel today. So we want to really thank the USGBC LA for their championing of this episode. And the LA Chamber of Commerce. We're really thrilled to have Maria Salinas, the president and CEO of the LA Chamber, here today to introduce today's webinar and also to serve on our panel. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Maria Salinas. Again, she's the president and CEO of the Los Angeles Area Chamber of Commerce. Maria, thanks so much for joining us today. Why don't you tell us a little bit about the LA Chamber and what your role is as a leader in the sustainability and resilience movement?
Great. Thank you, Evan. Thank you so much for having me here. I'm so pleased to be here to be representing the Los Angeles Area Chamber of Commerce, one of the largest chambers in the country and certainly serving the region here in Los Angeles. On this topic, I'm so pleased to be part of this discussion, a very important discussion. You know that during the last year, as we face the challenges of the pandemic, we've learned much about our communities, our economies, and our institutions. Angelinos have always known the danger of events, from wildfires to earthquakes and everything in between. And as we emerge from the pandemic, the need for greater resiliency is evident. If we are to thrive, we must prepare for the next disaster. That's our life. Preparedness is the key to safety in our region, and it's the key to economic resiliency. Over the past year, the Chamber has focused on being flexible and adaptable while reflecting on how to be ready for the next inevitable emergency. Business resiliency has been seen throughout the pandemic. Many businesses have reimagined their systems and processes to reemerge stronger. And that's something that we are always advocating for, is that we know we're going to reemerge stronger. But there's still so much work to be done. This is why the Chamber is proud to host the Resilience Advantage webinar series featuring leading experts in architecture, business, structural engineering, seismology, finance, and more, sharing the many ways business and community leaders can prepare for a specific kind of natural disaster, earthquakes. COVID has shown us the importance of preparing for natural disasters. Businesses in Los Angeles and throughout the West can be especially vulnerable to earthquakes without proper preparation. This Resilience Advantage webinar series is an important tool to help business leaders and public officials effectively prepare our region for earthquakes and other disasters to safeguard our communities. And now I would like to introduce a video by Los Angeles Mayor Eric Garcetti, a longtime proponent of green design, sustainability, and resilience, who will share a few words with us about this important topic.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Mayor Garcetti, and welcome to this session of the Resilience Advantage series, exploring the relationship between resilience and sustainability. In Los Angeles, we know how closely these two issues are linked, and we understand that the decisions we make today are going to shape the lives of our children and our grandchildren. That's why we're working to source more of our water and power locally, why we're working to build a more resilient and more prepared city. Together with our partners, we created an early earthquake warning system that has been adopted now statewide. And we focused on seismic retrofit programs for buildings and water, conveyance systems, as well as telecommunication infrastructure. And we vastly expanded our emergency preparedness programs, so families throughout our city and neighborhoods everywhere and our business community will be ready to respond in a crisis and be more aware of how to help one another. Let me thank everyone who has helped to put this Resilience Advantage series together, including the U.S. Resilience Council, Optimum Seismic, LA Chamber, BizFed, and LA EDC. And thank you to all the members of our business and building communities who are participating today. Thank you for the action you will take to learn more about resilience. You see, if everyone does their part, Los Angeles will be more prepared, better equipped to emerge from any challenge better than before. And together, I know we will make Los Angeles stronger and more resilient. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'm Mayor Garcetti.
Thank you to the mayor. I'd also like to thank our major partners, organizations which have worked for years to focus attention on the vital message of earthquake resilience for our business community. Our major partners include, in addition to ourselves, the LA Area Chamber of Commerce. They include Los Angeles County Business Federation, Los Angeles County Economic Development Corporation, U.S. Resiliency Council, and Optimum Seismic, which also sponsors the series as a public service. And I'd be remiss if I did not recognize our very own board member, Ali Sahabi from Optimum Seismic, who has been a champion in this area. I'd also like to thank our co-champion for today's episode, the U.S. Green Building Council LA, which has worked hard to promote sustainability and is supporting the important message of this series. And now, Evan, please tell our audience more about today's Resilience Advantage program.
Maria, thank you so much. I really appreciate your great words and introduction today, and certainly the support that we've had from the LA Chamber. It's been a pleasure to get to know you and your staff over the past year, so thank you. Our goal in this series is to tell the story of how investing in readiness for natural disasters benefits everyone. Each episode focuses on a specific part of the story. Recent episodes on resilient communities, resilient new design, retrofitting existing buildings have all shared important information. Today, you'll see the important connection between green design, sustainability, and resilience. We really need to examine all of these topics fully to understand the complex world of our built infrastructure and the natural perils that impact it. The episode you're about to see goes beyond green design and earthquake safety. These topics are important, and even more important is how and why they overlap. You'll learn why you can't really have sustainability without resilience. You'll better understand why sustainability and resilience are good investments and good business for property owners and developers wanting to protect their businesses, investments, tenants, and our environment. We hope you enjoy this production and stay tuned following for a discussion with our expert panelists. So without further ado, I give you the Resilience Advantage. Welcome to the Resilience Advantage, a series brought to you by the U.S. Resiliency Council and Optimum Seismic. I'm your host, Evan Reese. In this episode, we'll be exploring what resilience means to the long-term sustainability of our communities in the face of natural disasters like earthquakes, hurricanes, floods, wildfire, and now even pandemics. It's a sobering reality that the impacts of natural disasters are increasing in the United States and around the world, as a function of both climate change and infrastructure growth in high-hazard areas. Camilla Seth is Managing Director of the Finance Hub, a leader in conservation finance, and also a member of the U.S. Resiliency Council's Board of Directors. We recruited her to join us out of a recognition of the essential need to expand the conception of sustainable design and climate change, to also include disaster prevention and mitigation.
There's no question that the frequency and severity of natural disasters has increased, and that the impact on communities is no longer something that we can't focus on or only focus on in terms of relief. We are already into, whether it's climate resilience or other types of sustainability issues that we need to adapt to.
California legislator Adrian Nazarian, representing the San Fernando Valley, explains how the Northridge earthquake in 1994 affected every aspect of the community, and how without a change in practices, things will be worse when the next inevitable extreme event occurs.
What happened in '94, we saw the displacement that it caused in our educational institutions, our business production, our daily routine activities. We saw the impacts, we saw the devastation of the cost, and that was at a time where the buildings that were around at that time were not as old as they are now. Now, 26 some years later, you can imagine how much more vulnerable we are. And what's very scary is that at a time like this, with the housing crunch that we have many individuals, vulnerable individuals, living in the most vulnerable buildings that will be the first to be impacted by earthquakes.
The severity of natural disasters in the U.S. is straining even our capacity to rebuild and recover from them. Our communities seem to be falling behind decade after decade, particularly for the most vulnerable. Lori Schumann is Senior Program Director for Resilience at Enterprise Community Partners, which has led the way for decades on housing and economic development in the U.S. states and territories like Puerto Rico.
You know, Katrina occurred about 14 years ago, and still much of the Ninth Ward has not been repaired. We still see damage from Superstorm Sandy from New York, and this is New York City, which thinks of itself as the most advanced bureaucracy in the country. We also know that it's very difficult to rebuild affordable housing. A lot of communities reject the rebuilding of affordable housing after an event. If we look at Galveston, Texas, close to 80% of its affordable housing was lost from Hurricane Ike, and not even 60% of that has been rebuilt.
Ultimately, we have to recognize that we cannot avoid our way out of the impacts of climate change. We've crossed the Rubicon, where we must learn to live with at least some of its effects. Organizations like the U.S. Green Building Council, Los Angeles, and its executive director, BenStapleton, are taking on this new aspect of the sustainability challenge.
I think the conversation has shifted over the last few years, and rightfully so. Look, I'd love to say that we can change as a society and turn the Titanic here a little bit to avoid the greatest impacts of climate change, and I'm still a believer in that. I've been doing this work for a long time now, but I think it'd be foolish if we weren't looking at how do we adapt as well. We have to learn how do we adapt while we try to save and prepare for a future that's going to be a little different.
Beyond the lessons we've learned from climate disasters and earthquakes, the impacts of COVID-19 have taught us that investing in preparedness is essential if we're going to limit the devastation from the next extreme event.
These kinds of large systemic disruptions, whether they're in the health arena or in natural disasters that affect the built environment, they are coming, and they are going to continue to come.
It's critical for us to think about how we're taking the appropriate steps to protect our investments, our loved ones, and the continuous ability in the future to conduct business the way we have been, and to not be hampered by a major seismic event.
Addressing problems, particularly the infrastructure challenges, brick and mortar challenges before an event is fundamentally the most cost-effective and prudent way to ensure that communities will be safeguarded after the event.
We discussed in previous episodes of this Resilience Advantage series that in a typical city, 80 to 90% of the building stock was built prior to the development of modern building codes. It's simply not economically or socially practical to rebuild all of our vulnerable buildings. It's also not environmentally wise.
Existing buildings are a huge part of this issue. In fact, I often think there's far too much focus on new buildings. 1 to 2% of our buildings are new on an annual basis. We tend to focus on that and focus on the code that addresses those and very little on the existing building stock. You know, from a sustainability standpoint, the highest and best use of an existing building is to find out how to use what's already there.
Architects and other design professionals have been working on new ways to measure sustainability and find ways to achieve it.
You know, there's this concept of operational carbon and embodied carbon. The operational carbon is really what it takes to run an asset. That's the concrete, the steel, the glass, the carpet, you know, all the elements of that building, those materials. There's an embodied carbon to really create those. And one of the things I've been really encouraged by over the past few years is we've started to have a lot more transparency around the embodied carbon in materials.
In 2012, Superstorm Sandy left more than 10 million tons of debris in its wake. All that debris had to be hauled by smog-spewing trucks to landfills, where it will sit and leach toxic chemicals into the air and water for decades. And then, 10 million tons of new building materials had to be created to replace the buildings that were destroyed. So really, how sustainable is a building if the environmental cost at the end of its life far surpasses any environmental savings it might have achieved during its life?
There's a Venn diagram of sustainability and resilience, and I think there's a significant amount of overlap. To me, in order to be a truly sustainable society or have a truly sustainable building, that means that it's resilient. That's how it's going to be sustained long term.
One of the clearest examples of the negative social and economic impacts of natural disasters and their extreme cost to the environment were the back-to-back earthquakes that occurred in Christchurch, New Zealand in 2010 and 2011. Brendan Winder works for the city of Christchurch, helping to manage the ongoing recovery from the twin earthquakes. Brendan, what was it like to drive into Christchurch following the second and larger earthquake in February 2011?
It had been a very significant earthquake, and I was beginning to see large buildings badly damaged, large trees had fallen over. It was sort of on the way into town, it gradually became very apparent the scale of the earthquake was significant. There was somewhere in the region of 500,000 to 1 million truck movements from the city. So on roads that weren't particularly designed for trucks, through suburbs that don't normally see demolition trucks moving at all. Lots of people put effort into bundling stuff up in containers and sending it off to Pacific Islands and other parts of the world that could do with some of this material. Some of it was carted around the country, and a lot of it was put into landfill, unfortunately, and no one wanted to do that, but the economics didn't stack up.
A recent documentary described a 25-meter tall mound that was created to store all of the debris generated by the earthquakes. When building debris is hauled off to a landfill after a natural disaster, there often isn't time to remove and properly dispose of toxic chemicals and materials that are part of any building.
But when buildings come down, when they collapse or when they're demolished, it releases a whole lot of fibre asbestos into the air, and that had to be managed. So there was a whole heap of work done on how we could do that quickly, but in a safe manner as well. So, one of the other things that happens in this environment, as you'll understand, with the number of buildings coming down, is we need to cut up concrete. And in some cases you can just crush it, in other cases you actually need to cut the concrete. And concrete dust in itself is a health risk.
If there's a silver lining to this story, it may be that Christchurch and New Zealand have learned a valuable lesson about the importance of resilient design. Engineering, construction, and city planning practices have changed so that when the next earthquake inevitably strikes the country, its buildings will perform better and its cities will recover more quickly.
But we've got to learn the lessons from these emergencies, and putting back vulnerable houses and vulnerable communities back into vulnerable parts of the countryside is just dumb. So we need to take the smart long-term view. If we are going to build back, let's just build better. So how do we put in better housing in better places and ensuring better outcomes?
It's a painful way to learn such an important lesson, and hopefully other countries are wise enough not to wait until such a disaster strikes them before taking action. The good news is that the goals of green and sustainable design are mutually possible and beneficial. Cities like Los Angeles and business leaders worldwide have begun to embed sustainability in their organizational structures and culture via internal sustainability policies and the establishment of C-suite positions like Chief Sustainability Officer. Increasingly, disaster resilience is being considered as a complementary necessity to those efforts.
In fact, with the city's resilience plan and the city's sustainability plan, there is a ton of overlapping goals. And those goals can make for a more efficient city, make a more resilient city, and a more sustainable city.
We talked with Michelle Jones of RIM Architects about how this is affecting client demand and satisfaction in some of her projects.
I think that's really important for our clients to understand. They're looking at how long they're holding the asset, what their current initial investment, their CapEx cost is, and they're looking for the basis to understand how that's going to spread over the life of the building.
Another disturbing future that COVID-19 foreshadows is the potential cumulative and cascading impacts, when multiple systemic shocks might happen at the same time. Just consider the social and economic impacts COVID-19 has wrought on our world, this without damage to a single building. It takes an entire nation dedicated and focused on combating the pandemic in order to be successful. Jurisdictions, philanthropists, nonprofits, financial institutions, researchers, and consultants all need to recognize the interconnectedness around the goals of resilience and then get involved.
So resilience is really a community effort. We as a city, I as a city, the mayor as a city, can't do it all alone. It really takes partnerships, and resilience really builds on itself.
Over the last 20 years, there has been an incredibly significant change in the degree to which philanthropy has been working outside of the nonprofit sector, but also with business and communities around issues of sustainability and how to embed them into markets and finance. Being in the middle of a crisis like we're in is, in fact, putting a big bright light around this issue of resilience and preparedness.
BenStapleton spoke with me about the genesis of the green movement and how the development of tools such as building performance rating systems to measure and communicate resilience can advance the conversation about what's achievable.
You know, essentially, everyone needs a roadmap, right, and a guide to figure out how to get the structure in place to achieve goals. If you think back to the 90s, there just wasn't that in existence, right? People really need to figure out, what was a shared common plan to address how do we green an asset? How do we provide some rigor to that process, and then informing that rigor, the LEED system, has bronze, silver, gold levels. It has a base level. That rigor allows there to be some ranking and some ultimately certification on what people are doing.
What can the resilience movement learn from the successes and even some of the missteps of the green movement over the past 20 years?
I think what hurt the green movement to begin with is that it was too much about this is the right thing to do. Yes, it's the right thing to do, but we should be really focusing on the ROI, on that return on investment, and looking at the economic model. And I think that's a lesson that resilience can take from this. I think for resilience, there needs to be a discussion around, there's a tangible ROI for us to build a resilient asset versus a non-resilient asset.
Several national studies have shown that resilient design of new buildings and the mitigation of our existing inventories makes good business sense. This has gained the attention of our political leaders.
When you know that if you put $1 today in the bank, it's not going to become $4 tomorrow, but the $1 of investment towards seismic retrofit helps save $4 tomorrow, then that's a no-brainer. The alternative cost isn't high enough to warrant us not to make this investment. We need to make this investment.
By showing that resilience is good business, we can change minds and spur action over and above just the idea that resilience is a moral imperative.
In resilience, we need to do the same thing and really focus on that ROI and have this not be about, hey, this is this is the best thing you should be doing to prepare yourself in the event of a disaster. It should be like, no, this is what's increasing the value of your asset long term and giving you a better portfolio.
We're seeing that a focus on resiliency is really complementary to what we're already doing with LEED. And it's also becoming prevalent in how our clients are looking at their projects, how they design spaces to connect with their people, to support their people, be able to operate their businesses, and be able to respond in case there is some type of a catastrophic event.
The U.S. Green Building Council, the developer of the LEED rating system, recently unveiled a new standard called RELY. The RELY standard is looking beyond green design to sustainability that includes resilience. The U.S. Resiliency Council's Building Performance Rating System for earthquakes has been adopted as a component of RELY.
I think the RELY program is, I think it's a benefit that USRC is a component of that. And I think that if we can continue to spread the word on this, it's going to pick up momentum just like LEED has.
Lori Schumann of Enterprise expressed excitement over the role that approaches like RELY and the U.S. Resiliency Council's three-dimension 5-star rating system can play.
A rating system will help us start the conversation about how to quantify their risk and quantify their improvements. We are desperate for a way to quantify the return on investment for this work. So a rating system would help us start thinking about a benchmark. And a benchmark is what we need in the industry to help us think about where buildings are at with respect to their resiliency. The rating system will not only help the owners, it'll help the regulators and the program directors and the housing departments figure out where their greatest vulnerability is as they seek investment.
One of the keys to success is to make resilience a part of the design process right from the beginning. Another important component of a successful resilience strategy is our ability to gain support from a broad array of stakeholder groups, including the private, public, and philanthropic sectors. The most influential expression of that support can come through incentives to motivate owners to invest in resilience. Jonathan Cohen is a developer and historic building advocate in Portland, Oregon, and co-owner of a recently retrofitted hotel that achieved a USRC Silver rating. We asked him what would help developers become more receptive to increasing the resilience of existing buildings.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think the answer in the current environment is just cash. It could be preferable loan terms or a really favorable loan to assist with that. And we need some real policymakers above the level of administrative folks at the planning agencies to support this.
There's still a lot of innovation that can be used in financing. I worked on some of the PACE financing, so the property assessed financing for clean energy and energy efficiency retrofits here in LA County. I actually really think that's a good model. I think this concept of improvements to buildings that have a public benefit, and in my mind that includes efficiency and sustainability improvements, but also resiliency improvements.
I think it's critical that the state takes appropriate steps to further incentivize local jurisdictions to want to also go that route. And so I think it's going to be very important for the state to come up with incentive programs, whether through tax credits or loan programs, to ensure that local jurisdictions are taking advantage of these programs and then further either incentivizing or requiring their businesses and residents to make the upgrades necessary for their safety.
I think what we've learned is that for the big pressing problems, you need action from all sides. You need collaboration across government, philanthropy, and business. And the unique role of philanthropy is to identify something that has not been sufficiently addressed and to seed new ideas and to help get them to scale to a point where perhaps government funding will come in and kick it to the next level.
We began this episode with the reality of the increased occurrence and severity of natural hazards as a result of population exposure, climate change, and other forces. Past disasters like Sandy, Katrina, and many other hurricanes, as well as the Northridge and Christchurch earthquakes, demonstrate the environmental and socioeconomic consequences of past building practices and the magnitude of the future catastrophes we face if we don't change our approach now. Private and public organizations, communities, philanthropies, businesses, and design professionals are all finding ways to advance both green and resilient design. But we need more collective action to educate and incentivize these investments in our future. We invite you to view other episodes in the Resilience Advantage series to learn about the benefits of resilient design and to join us in advancing this critical movement towards true sustainability. In our next episode, we'll look at the science and technology that is making resilience possible and affordable. I hope you'll join us on the Resilience Advantage. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for viewing that episode. A real shout out to Compassion Unlimited, the producer of all of our Resilience Advantage episodes. I've done a great job, and I really hope you appreciated that episode. So with that, we are about to start our panel discussion, and I would like to introduce our panelists. I'd like to welcome back Maria Salinas, who is the president and CEO of the LA Chamber of Commerce, and BenStapleton, who you saw actually on the video, the executive director of the U.S. Green Building Council, Los Angeles. I'd like to introduce panelists Elaine I, who is Association Regional Manager at RWDI, an international engineering consulting firm. And Emily Mazzaparetti, Global Head of Moodys Climate Solutions with Moodys Corporation. And then Gail Napel, she is an architect, a lead accredited professional. She's a senior associate and co-director of firm-wide design resilience at Gensler Associates, one of the nation's leading and largest architectural firms. So glad to have all of you join us today. Thank you so much for taking the time. As a reminder to the audience, please submit your questions in the chat button on your screen, and we'll try and get to as many as possible. So let me start with you, Elaine. Your expertise is as a consultant on green design and health metrics for buildings. You're very familiar with standards like LEED and the well building standard. Can you tell us a little bit about how these standards have helped to improve the design of buildings, say, over the past 20 years?
Yeah, I can actually go further back than 20 years. I've been in this industry for quite a while. I spent about 20 years in architectural firms working on the design side. And then in 2000, got involved with the U.S. Green Building Council and sustainability. We were the 30th member of the U.S. Green Building Council. And to date, we've certified over 800 buildings. So I have seen in my career a tremendous impact. I remember sitting at tables 20 years ago saying, can we make this a green project? And nobody really understanding what that meant. Since then, what we've seen is codes have had a huge impact on design. The U.S. Green Building Council really is the lead rating system. It's really the leading framework in the world today. We do a lot of work on an international stage, and by far they are the leading framework, and many other frameworks kind of copy and mimic elements that is in the lead rating system. I've seen manufacturers completely change how they design and manufacture product, from plumbing fixtures to building materials with low VOCs. Design teams now do not start a project without at least acknowledging, should we make this a lead project or not a lead project? If you're a new building coming out of the ground today, a commercial asset or even a residential asset, chances are that you're going to be a green building of some aspect. The LEED really focuses on the environmental impact as well as health and wellness. And then, well, I have to completely give a shout out to the IWBI Association and the WELL rating system, because as a complement to LEED, they have really opened everyone's eyes around the health impact that buildings have on humans. from air quality and ventilation and water quality. And it is completely bringing a different conversation to the table than what we've had before. So it's very refreshing. These rating systems have been a pivotal change in our society and how we design, operate, and manage buildings.
Thanks, Elaine. Thanks so much. Yeah, and a shout out to the Well folks. They've got commercials with J-Lo and Lady Gaga, so you know it has achieved real mainstream success. So congratulations to them. Gail, you're an architect. The American Institute of Architects, AIA, was really key to the genesis and the growth of LEED. They were a very early adopter, promoter of the green design movement. So was Gensler. How did that sort of embrace of the green design movement really help improve the profession and raise the demand for architectural services?
Well, thank you. Great question, Evan. So architects are licensed for health and safety. And safeguarding the health of the planet is essential to safeguard human health. And this has certainly been driven home to us by all the recent events, catastrophic flooding, wildfire, air pollution. So embracing sustainable, resilient design, which at its core is as old as our profession itself, we've known how to do some of these things for a very long time, reminded us as architects that we have both responsibility and agency to create healthy environments for people and for the planet. Clients who care deeply about their own well-being and that of the planet insist on architectural services that support those values. And looking for those triple bottom line outcomes, includes financial co-benefits of resource conservation and cost avoidance, which is indeed resilience.
Yeah, I think that's great. I think one of the things Ben said in the video, BenStapleton, was just a comment about how everybody needs some sort of benchmark, some sort of communication device. So being a structural engineer myself, I know how complicated the professions of engineering and architecture are. They don't always translate all that easily to the public. And so though you've been doing green design for many, many years, this ability to translate it into something that's communicatable to the public has obviously been a big advantage. Can you tell us a little bit about the accomplishments that AIA has achieved through its embrace of green design? What were some of and also, to be fair, what were some of the bigger challenges that held back wider and quicker adoption of the green movement?
Well, certainly, in terms of accomplishments, connection to the larger environmental community in the world and consequently scaled impact, 2030 Challenge, U.S. Resiliency Council, U.S. Green Building Council, policymakers. I mean, that is absolutely an accomplishment that AIA is very proud of. Definitely public awareness of the building industry's carbon footprint and the positive impact our industry can have on climate change if we address that carbon footprint. And, I'd like to believe that architecture is still one of the most trusted professions in the world, and embracing sustainable, resilient design further strengthens its legitimacy through association with people like structural engineers and environmentalists who tend to be, trusted professionals. In terms of challenges, there's been a lack of understanding of the true impact that buildings have on human and planetary well-being. We're understanding that better and better, but historically that's been a bit of an issue. And there was a persistent perception for a long time that sustainable and resilient design is always more expensive, primarily because our society, let's face it, we're in the habit of prioritizing the value of first costs and discounting long-term costs such as health, operational savings, and environmental degradation and resilience. But I think we're rapidly learning that those long-term effects are absolutely worth looking at up front. And it's interesting, there can be a disconnect if, for example, we pay a great deal more for a design or a building that's perceived as beautiful, but it performs poorly from a health and wellness, and environmental or an operations perspective. And so there's this disconnect of not necessarily thinking of the ROI on beauty, and the ROI on performance is is, perhaps a little easier to come up with metrics for. So that's, I think that's something that we as a society just have to learn. And then there was one more challenge is a lack of commonly applied codes and standards, which has been helped by things like LEED and RELY. And when there aren't codes and standards, then there's a tendency to default to local building code for technical guidance, and that does not always give you sufficient knowledge to create, to design and build buildings that have high performance.
Oh, that's great, Gail. It reminds me of some of the things that we've discussed in past episodes. Both this idea of what building codes are designed to do, primarily to protect safety, right? To make sure that buildings function, protect the safety of their occupants, both day to day and in the event of natural disasters. They're often, codes are often designed and tuned to balance those costs with, or those goals with the costs of construction, right? To keep construction affordable. And so this question that you bring up about measuring ROI, Ben mentioned that also in the video, and I'm going to ask Ben a question in a second, really adds the ability to think about something beyond just first cost. If you're an owner of a building, how to protect the asset itself, how to protect your business revenue, those are all returns on extra investments. I'll just say really briefly, your comment about how it's easier to sell the beauty of architectural design sometimes than the ROI on resilient design. And we'll have to put this on the screen in a future episode. But there was this great image that a friend of mine took from a subway in Tokyo, Japan. It was of the basement of a building. It was for a luxury multi-million-dollar condo in Tokyo, but the image was of the basement and these base isolators and structural systems that made that building resilient to earthquakes. And that's what sold a multi-million-dollar apartment in Tokyo. Whereas in California, you see rooftop images of couches overlooking, a skyline and fire pits. And so changing that perception of what makes a building valuable is important. So let me bring in Ben Stapleton, again, Executive Director of USGBC LA, to talk a little bit about what some of these environmental, economic, and social costs that Gail mentioned are when buildings collapse, as we saw in Christchurch, or even are seriously damaged in earthquakes and other natural disasters.
Yeah, thank you, Evan. And I think we've all experienced this in different ways, especially here in California over the last few years. And the example I'll point to, I lived through the 1994 earthquake. I lived right at the epicenter in Northridge. So that's one thing I could point to. But I think more recently, we've all experienced the impacts of wildfire in our communities. And I think a few years ago, it was, hey, maybe you knew somebody who knew someone who'd experienced some challenge from that. And now everyone has a story of someone in their family or themselves, directly dealing with those impacts. And so, you think about those costs. Look at the money we've spent as a state to fight wildfire over the last couple of years. Now that's billions upon, billions of dollars. If we look at that and say, how do we take that and look at how to avoid those costs from the beginning, looking at how to better position our buildings or communities, through either home hardening techniques or landscape hardening techniques, leveraging native plants, all these other things that are important. We could have avoided a lot of those costs. And, that's really what, when we come down to sustainability and resilience, that's really a lot of what we're talking about. So, the cost to recreate an asset when it's knocked down because of an earthquake, we're looking again at, as I spoke about in the video, about all those embodied costs to produce those materials. That money to recreate that building, whether that comes from insurance or from state funding or whatever it is, has to come from somewhere. And we're basically continuing to raise our costs to exist as a society. And then the impacts those can have on families and economies, that's huge, right? Those are ripple impacts over time. Someone losing a job just once or losing their home and having to deal with insurance. That's, some people, it takes a year, 2 years or longer to go through that process to replace a home when it gets knocked down. And that has a huge emotional cost. So, I don't want to understate those costs, but I think that, again, if we kind of look at what we've all been through wildfire, and how much we were trying to essentially treat the problem after the fact. I think that's a very sort of American thing we do sometimes. We're not necessarily, we're treating the symptom, not the cause. I think we need to really look at the cause a little bit more to reduce our long-term costs.
Thanks, Ben. That's great. I really appreciate that long-term perspective. Long-term perspective is something that sometimes is hard to come by in our country, in our communities. But we can look to leaders like, say, the LA Chamber of Commerce on how businesses, big and small, sort of think long-term. Maria Salinas, first, why don't you start off by just telling us a little bit about what the Chamber of Commerce is? I'm not sure everybody really knows what a chamber is and what it does. And tell us about the membership of the LA Chamber, which I understand is really one of the largest in the country.
Yes, thank you very much for giving me that opportunity. So the LA Chamber is basically a business advocacy organization. We are one of the largest in the country. We're a regional chamber. So we very much cover the greater Los Angeles region, which for our purposes, it includes the 5 counties: Ventura, Orange County, Riverside, and San Bernardino. We work very closely with other regional chambers statewide as well as nationally. A lot on public policy that is impacting the business community, but also looking at resources and information that is relevant for businesses to be able to thrive. And not just businesses, but we know that businesses operate in communities and that communities need to be strong. So for this topic, when we're talking about preparedness and resiliency, I mean, it's very important to the business community. The whole work around preparedness, as you know, as many of you have mentioned, it really is at the core of ensuring that we have built in safety nets for, business leaders and business owners so that they can conduct their business when disaster strikes.
Maria, that's great. I want to follow up on what you just said because it really relates this idea of businesses in a city are more than just a collection of individual buildings, right? Or individual companies. They form a very complex network that's essential in helping communities function. Ben just mentioned, the issues around how damage to individual buildings can have a cascading effect. It can affect, obviously, the tenants in the building or the homeowners, but obviously the businesses that employ those, the people that live in those places. How does the chamber and your members think of their role and their responsibility in making communities vibrant, resilient, and also the people within those communities?
Yeah, and you know what? I would say we have to start with education. Information like what is being shared in this forum and in previous forums is so key and so important for businesses and business owners to have, especially our small businesses. I can tell you through educating, let me step back. When a disaster strikes, what does a business owner think? Whether they're in a large building, a smaller commercial center, they want to ensure that they understand the safety around the building and could they return? When can they return? When can they resume operations? And sometimes there's a disconnect between what businesses need and want and what the emergency responders are doing. So for us, it's really important that our businesses understand that there's a process and there's a system in place to ensure that there's a safety protocol so that they can resume operations. So having said that, then what do businesses do in the meantime? And that's where the whole preparedness comes into play for businesses. Do they have a satellite office? Do they have systems that allow them to go to a remote location of some kind? And I think this pandemic has definitely demonstrated that and has shown our small business community especially that there's a big gap in making sure that we have those backup plans are in place for businesses.
Maria, thank you so much for talking about how a community, if a community is going to be resilient, the businesses and the buildings that serve those communities have to be resilient. And so I'm going to bring Emily Mazzacaruti into this conversation. She's with Moodys. Of course, Moodys, as we all know, is one of the premier organizations in understanding and quantifying risk that businesses face, whether it be, for their own operations, but also for things like lending and insurance. And the ability of a business to sort of remain functional, continue to generate revenue, and all of that stuff is an important part of its creditworthiness. So maybe you can talk a little bit about, and give us maybe a little bit of background on what your experience with, I know the company that you founded, 427, about how climate and other natural peril risks really affect the creditworthiness of investments or businesses.
Thank you, Evan, and thanks for having me. I'll start with a small disclaimer, which is to say within Moody's broader universe, there's the credit ratings agency, which I do not represent. And there's the rest of the group where we do a lot of risk modeling and analysis, and that's what I'll speak to today. So if you talk about, let's start with building and real estate as an example, right? There's a wide range of touch points and potential drivers of risk that will turn those natural hazards into credit, financial, economic risk. Starting with the building itself, the property, as we've talked about today, there can of course be direct impacts to the building. Worst case scenario, full destruction. We've talked about that, but also just things that may make it not run so well on a day-to-day basis, chronic impacts around heat or water consumption, chronic flooding, what we're seeing in some communities on the East Coast in Florida, where sea level rise is driving a little bit of flooding once a month, right? The building isn't broken, but it's still affecting its ability to function and, of course, its value itself. Then you sort of go to the next concentric circle and you look at impacts on the local community. And we've talked a little bit about that already, but impacts on the local infrastructure, of course. Impact on property taxes if there is a need to finance either adaptation or reconstruction after an event. Impacts on demographics and the long-term economic growth of the region. If you think about water stress maybe and the impact on some industries to be able to continue to thrive in water parched regions like maybe California, Texas, the Western US at large. All of this can affect then who wants to live where. And so again, going back to a building, that has impacts on its financial worthiness. And then the next concentric circle is really looking at the entire value chain around financing real estate. And all the way from developers to insurers, realtors, banks, lenders, investors, taxpayers, everybody has something to lose if the building is not functioning. And that same kind of thinking also applies when looking at businesses. So when we look at modeling the credit risk related and how climate change affects the probability of default of a business, for example, we're going to be looking at what industry that business is in, where it is located, whether it has the financial wherewithal to withstand some kind of shocks, and how we think that's going to impact valuation or cash flow, or whether we're going to see some kind of shock to the asset or one of its assets in a way that really could affect its long-term default risk. So it's complex, and not all of this can be modeled or assessed necessarily in a data-driven way. That's something that we're working on. There's modeling direct exposure and potential impact on a building or on a single business is one thing. Really understanding the broader ripple effect. And I could keep going with my concentric circles, right? If you think of migrations and and if you think of some of the long-term impacts on biodiversity and ecosystems. So we need to be just bring a little humility in how we look at those risks to understand what we can model to the best of our ability and what are the broader impacts that we may not be able to factor in, but that can still impact the business's long-term financial outcomes.
Great. Yeah. Well, when I started as an engineer 33 years ago, and I'm sure Elaine and Gail can relate as architects and consultants. We primarily focused on the building. We have a job to do, we have a code to meet, we design the building, and then all of those other decisions, all of those other concentric circles that you mentioned, didn't really play into at least my decision making back 30 some odd years ago. But Gail mentioned already today that architects have continuously tried to grow their influence and their contribution to some of these larger concentric circles. And so I think that going forward, and I've talked to a number of students about this, and actually in our next episode, we're going to be interviewing some students in architectural engineering from a local university about where they see their future being. And a lot of that, I believe, is contributing more and more to these circles that you say that are outside just focusing on a beam or a column or a wall system or something like that. So give us some thoughts, if you could, about what we should be aware of. What kind of metrics are important for engineers and architects to be able to provide, organizations like yours, companies like yours, to help, expand the value that we can provide in these larger circles of impact?
Sure. And there's a couple of different ways to answer that question. The first thing that I'll say is that we are squarely focused on making sure that metrics that are currently used to understand climate risk, to understand credit risk, my apologies, and to drive decisions for banks, for investors, that those metrics reflect climate change. That is not a thing on the side, but that it is fully integrated into the tools and indicators that are already used for decision making. And that's important because climate change is not optional curriculum. It's just part of the world that we live in, and we need to factor that in. Now, the way we do that, we do input different type of metrics around exposure to climate, to different type of hazards. We also do the same work for transition risk. So understanding how a company or a building might be affected in the long term, depending on its ability to make a positive contribution to net zero carbon, or maybe not be able to adjust to the new expectations and requirements of the world. A lot of the metrics that we use right now feeding into those models are focused on exposure. For example, for physical climate risk, this is where we look at a set of indicators that will cover the key climate impacts as defined by the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. That's the global organization that sort of defines and regulates, not regulates, but helps coordinate how the world think about climate change from a scientific standpoint. So those hazards include both extreme weather event type hazards. Those would be hurricanes and typhoons, floods, wildfires, but also some more chronic impacts like heat stress, water stress, sea level rise. And for each of these, we'll make an assessment of whether a building or a business has high or low exposure using a range of different scientific data sets that help us understand current and future conditions. Now, I'm probably going to speak right to your heart, but the thing we're not doing well right now is resilience because of the lack of standardization, transparency, and a trusted set of benchmarks as to how well is a building prepared. And so we see those metrics taken into account a little bit in more building-specific analysis for due diligence, for example, but it's not something that is currently factored in at scale because the data is lacking.
Oh, that's wonderful. So Ben, let me follow up with you on what Emily just said about these metrics. It's something you actually talked about in the video as well, this idea of calculating return on investment. Maybe you could expand a little bit on that. What are the kinds of metrics that design professionals like engineers and architects can extract from building design to measure this kind of return on investment? And what have the people that you've spoken with in the Los Angeles area said about the importance of having these metrics?
No, I mean, first of all, I think metrics are important in everything we do, right? It comes back to being able to communicate things with data, which we need to do long term. There's a few things I would reference. So one is really just the long-term operating costs of an asset, especially right now in the face of climate change. We have a higher number of heat days than a lot of systems were designed for. With wildfires, we have smoke, and we have to deal with how are we scrubbing our air that's going into our ventilation systems in our buildings. And that's even more true now that we've been experiencing COVID and this pandemic. We're paying more attention to that. So those are just a couple of examples, but what are the long-term operating costs of an asset? And that comes down to even things like landscaping and things that are attached to the building. I think for too long, and really in the development community, we've just been sort of forecasting out, this building will operate for 25 years, or the system won't even need to be replaced for 20 years. But it turns out maybe that's now not 20 years, maybe that's 15 years that system is going to last for. So greener buildings in general have a proven longer term reduced operating expense. I think we need to look at that same sort of standpoint from a resilience standpoint. So really taking a harder look at, what are the operating expenses to run an asset for 30, 50 years, whatever the time frame that is that makes sense. So that's one thing I think we need to look at. And then the second thing, and this kind of comes back to this comment about, just and occupant health. I mean, I think occupant health is so critical right now. As an issue, we really need to kind of lean into the awareness we have right now around the environments that we're in. And I've seen some really interesting tools recently when we look at, for instance, companies that are making decisions on renting space. They get so concerned on how many dollars are they paying per square foot, but they may be better served if they're really looking at, what is their productivity and health of their employees on a per square foot basis. So one tool that I've used and seen used is from JLL. They have a 330-300 tool, which really looks at the cost of space versus your operating expenses versus your impacts from productivity. And I like this approach because it helps a company really look at, so let's say I spend $1 an extra per square foot on office space to go into a green building, or maybe even a more resilient building if it's positioned that way. That's a building that's going to have better ventilation, more natural light. Those things are proven to reduce the number of sick days from employees, improve employee productivity by 3 or 4%, whatever that might be. And you have those in a tool, and it turns out, yes, you may be paying an extra $1 per square foot for rent, but you're going to be making an extra $300,000 a year from productivity and a loss of sick days. So, I think it just comes back to the models we've been using are sort of flawed. And you could even take this approach when we're looking at resilience, right? And if you're putting in a factor for lost number of days, due to a disaster, how do you model that out in productivity? Obviously, that's probably for the Moodys and the risk assessors of the world a little bit more than me, but typically we don't take that into account in our models, and I think we need to just be smarter about that.
Great, thanks. Well, let me bring Gail and Elaine back into this because they're sort of on the front lines, if you will, trying to help their clients incorporate these kinds of tools, using them tools themselves, help advising them about how to incorporate and why they should incorporate resilience into their design. So I'd like to have both of you sort of answer the question. Maybe Elaine, you can start about how you work with your clients and help them think about more broadly about the impacts of climate change and natural perils and what they can do about it to reduce their risk.
Yeah, good question. We approach it on a variety of different fronts. So first of all, if we're like in the RFP stage, we ask the question, even if it's not in the RFP, are you interested in resiliency and climate study? Have you addressed climate risk to whatever potential project might be going up? And then when we are in the design process, we always nudge the conversation and the question. We address it by looking at climate studies. So we do a climate analysis of whatever region that we're actually working within. And then from that, we'll go into like a bioclimatic analysis where we look at the overall site, the building, and look at the wind, the solar, thermal, rainfall, the impacts, the environmental impacts of that site, and then begin to inform from a very engineered technical analysis as far as what are the risks to that potential asset. On the existing building side, to Ben's point, there's a whole lot more existing buildings out there than there are new. We bring up the conversation as far as doing a resiliency assessment. So how can we understand and analyze your existing asset, your existing structure, understand what the climate risks are within your given region, and looking at the conditions of the building, the age of the building, the systems that are within that building, and provide a meaningful conversation and report that can help them with future capital and operational costs down the road. So they have to plan for upgrades. So it's more of a long-term process. On new construction, it's really focused on the design, the climate, the impacts. What can we do with that particular building to make a difference?
Gail, how about your thoughts? Thanks, Elaine.
Thank you, Elaine. So Gensler does some similar things. We have overlapping professions, but I also want to point out that, our work must address mitigation as well as adaptation. So that is definitely a focus that Gensler has had. I mean, we joined the AIA 2030 Challenge at its inception. We report our projects annually. And in 2019, our co-CEOs issued the Gensler Cities Climate Challenge to the building industry. And that challenge is to remove greenhouse gas emissions from our work by 2030 as a means of addressing the climate crisis from a mitigation point of view. Are we there? Not yet, but we're on the way. It's top of mind along with diversity, equity, and inclusion in our firm. So we constantly are developing and updating our tools and processes and sharing our learnings across the firm so we can establish targets for clients, track them, and ultimately meet that commitment that we made. I mean, it's a big ship to steer. We've got 50 offices and 5,300 people in multiple countries, where the challenges vary widely, from our work in Florida to work in Bangalore. The challenges climate-wise, resilience-wise can be very different. And for resilience very specifically, we also do research work through our Gensler Research Institute to inform projects. For example, our coastal work in Florida and other locations imminently vulnerable to sea level rise. We do research work in addition to project work to try to further inform what we're doing, and design for improved fresh air access and, on the opposite hand, for protection from wildfire smoke. These are increasingly large parts of our work and top of mind for our clients. So in those specific types of cases, we almost don't even have to bring it up in advance, although, we do try to bring it up in advance. One of the things that I think we often ask that is a good conversation starter is, what is your desired service life for this building? Do you really think it's only going to be there 25 years? Or do you, the AIA has a standard of saying that most buildings should be there for 100 years. And that really helps frame the conversation with a lot of our clients to say, wait a minute, not just the systems, but the building as a whole, and what is worth investing in from a resilience point of view in terms of structure and so on, versus what's worth investing in terms of, say, the interiors. And one of the key issues I think all designers face with resilience is that the risks we face from inequity and climate change are still somewhat intangible for a lot of people. I think more and more people are aware every day, certainly our clients are, but, let's be clear, you have to sort of set aside the 20-second attention span that we've kind of gotten into as a society, take a deep breath, and really consider, to Elaine's point, what is the magnitude of what we could face with this project and how do we mitigate it? And then we have to have the optimism to know that we can make a difference. I think that's something that we all need to encourage everyone to have. And then I always come back to the tree proverb with a lot of our clients too. The best day to plant a tree is 40 years ago, and the second best day is today. And we're still in today, so we can still do something.
That's great, Gail. Thanks. Well, then I'm going to ask you guys a sort of a follow-up to that, and then bring Maria into this, because I'm sure it's important to her members. Is not every person who's involved with the building, obviously, is the owner of the building. Of course, a lot of companies, rent space, or they buy existing buildings. And so, obviously over the past 20 years, green design has become sort of a marketable thing, right? Having a LEED rating for a building, a WELL rating now for buildings, increases the rental value, can increase the property value of the building. I gave you that example in Tokyo about how resilience is achieving that same kind of success in Japan. So what are your thoughts, Gail and Elaine, about how we can start to achieve the same success with those that might be sort of shopping for a building, if you will, that we have with green design. So I don't know who wants to start. Elaine?
Yeah, I'm happy to start with there. We work with a lot of asset managers, property managers that owns vast amount of real estate, North America and on an international basis. And we also work with some major retailers that are trying to make a significant impact with their project. So what we do when we work with folks like that is, and we've actually helped to develop some tools where we're doing a resiliency assessment and an analysis tool. So with some of these asset management firms, they're already tracking their assets as far as their carbon impact, whether their building has been certified or not, what's their Energy Star score. They're looking at their water, their energy. And so now they're also looking at it with a resiliency lens. So we actually built a tool for this one client in particular, where they're also tracking their variety of different assets, and they own and they manage and they operate different assets, and they're also buying and they're building assets. So by creating this tool, their asset managers can use this tool to actually analyze and help inform not only the risks within that area, but things that they need to do. And then what they also do, and what we're seeing very much involved, and it's akin with LEED and WELL, is GREBS, where GREBS is a tool that has been developed, and I believe it's actually owned and operated by USGBC now, where it is a real estate analytical tool that monitors their ESG, so environmental, social, and corporate governance. And so what any real estate asset actually puts their data in this tool, and they're actually evaluated on their performance around resiliency. They're evaluated around their performance around sustainability. And then based upon that, their asset can perform better and in turn actually sell for a higher rate, they can demonstrate lower operating cost and actually get higher rents for that particular space. So we're seeing, a lot of action. I'd love to see a lot more action in this area, but that's kind of where we're seeing the most impact.
And that's fabulous. And to add to what Elaine said, or to take us slightly an additional side to that, we have many clients who are tenants, and sometimes they're very large tenants. And when they're looking for buildings, exactly these kinds of things are top of mind. Many of our clients have made very progressive climate action commitments. Many of them are very, very concerned about health and wellness for their people. So we do tend to help them, when we are a part of the process of selecting a building, an existing building, and we also see that more and more large-scale tenants are asking building owners to make modifications if the building is still in design or construction to suit their values or their GRESB, ratings and so on. So actually, GRESB I think is for owners, not renters. But this is, as you say, it's something that's top of mind, and we have been really impressed with I would say almost an explosion in the last year of major global companies and smaller companies that have made very public commitments for progress on health and wellness and climate change. So it's top of mind more and more for everyone. And in a tenant situation, we are seeing more and more that tenants are looking at, how can I know for sure that building, does it have MERV 13 filters if it's in a wildfire smoke area? Does it have a rating system that shows me that it's got a certain performance level? Is it Energy Star? Or does it have, a health and wellness certification? So these are definitely things that are used by our clients, many people's clients, in order to assess whether or not to move into a building or not.
And just to add to Gail's point there, tenants, building owners, they want to get tenants back in their buildings. And using the lens of resiliency, sustainability, better building, health and wellness, that is a way to develop confidence in people workers getting back into the workplace and, corporations really operating their building at full efficiency and getting things a little bit back to normal. So these all play a strong role in that conversation.
Thank you both. So, Emily, you sort of heard about what's possible from the scientific point of view, the kinds of studies, and I know that you have a great deal of experience in that as well. So, how can, whether they're rating systems like the U.S. Resiliency Councils or these kinds of scientific studies and environmental studies that Elaine and Gail have talked about, how can they translate into incentives for owners, for investors to really go that extra mile and put resilience into their buildings?
Well, there's a great need for a standard, trusted system that will help bankers, lenders, investors understand whether a building meets certain expectations in terms of resilience. We have those for sustainability. They need to continue to evolve as the expectations are rising. For resilience, we don't have a well-established widespread system that's already used by those financial institutions. And that's really critical, because if you think of the situation of a bank or an investor that may have hundreds or thousands of buildings in their portfolio, in their commercial real estate lending portfolio, they're not going to go and look at every single asset and figure out whether the actual engineering meets the standards and is tailored to the risk that may be applicable to that building. They need to have something that is consistent, allows comparability, is, again, trusted, right? Understanding that there is a lot of expertise and credible industry groups and experts behind this that can vouch and say, yes, this meets these requirements, this level of expectations, would make a big difference. Because right now, as I mentioned, we're seeing some really forward-thinking investors working with experts like Gail and Elaine and engineering firms that really are thinking about those issues, but they're struggling to get recognition for this work, because they turn around and they get their insurance company or their own lender say, oh, you're in this part of town, we apply a premium to all properties in this neighborhood because we know there's flood risk. And, you may wave your arms and say, but my building is fine. That doesn't, right, that's just not enough. And so having something that would help the financial institutions understand and be able to do that at scale is really critical. And then once you have that kind of system, then as was mentioned earlier, you can see the premium, because the premium will appear, it will show up in differentiation around prices and rents and occupancy in the building. And so that will then help provide the incentive. And I don't want to oversell that in a sense that because we're missing the right signal, like about the building resilience, I think it's going to take a while to fix the fact that risk is mispriced right now. But we need to get that transmission working to get it underway so that over time, the premium that should be associated with this kind of resilience investment is recognized upstream by lenders and investors.
So Emily, I, as a structural engineer myself, it sounds to me like what I'm hearing from you is that there is a role for design professionals to play outside just opening up your code book and designing the beams and columns and HVAC systems. That engineers, architects too, are always thinking about ways to increase their value. And I know we have a lot of engineers and architects that participate and attend this series. There's a role for them to expand the type of work that they do in a meaningful way, to provide these kinds of metrics, these scientific credibility for why resilience is important. You'd agree?
Yes, absolutely. And I want to emphasize the fact that having those professionals come together and set those standards is really critical, because again, however talented each of the individuals are, if the banks or the investors have to do due diligence on who was the engineer and how good is their track record on this specific question, then it's just not going to happen, right? And it's not going to be factored in. And so you need to have something that's easy, that's that's easily recognizable, that can be a simple, set of signals. It doesn't have to be binary, obviously, there's a gradation, but we have great models for how that's being done for sustainability again, and building health and wellness. So there's a lot of things we can build on, leveraging the existing reporting standards, reporting mechanisms, the GRASB of the world that's also doing work on resilience, something that helps the broader community understand that the property managers or owners have taken this into considerations, have done the work, have invested, and have reached some, I can say with some degree of comfort, we're resilient up to a certain level. There's no absolute resilience, right? But so being able to provide that signal, I think, would really help make sure that the financial community can take that into account, and that it can be priced again in the building, and therefore incentivize further those investments by putting value on it.
So Maria Salinas, you've heard. Thank you, Emily. Maria, you've heard from design professionals like Gail and Elaine, from Emily, who and Ben, who really think about the return on investment and measuring the kinds of quantifying the benefits of resilient design. How do we take this to the business community? How does the business community get engaged with this idea that, wow, this stuff is achievable? You can actually measure not just the aspirational goals of being resilient or being green, but you can actually quantify that the same way you'd quantify, investing in advertising or improving the look of your building to attract more customers. How can we bring this to the business community, to your members?
Yeah, and thank you for that question, and these comments have just been really amazing to the insight that has been provided. I would say first we must recognize that there's probably two categories of businesses, or the larger employers, the larger tenants, if you will, that have built-in ESG programs where this is at the top of their list. They know that this is one of the things that's an important principle in how they do their business. And those entities, I think I'm not so much worried about, because many of them would have, key performance indicators that would include things like resiliency. I think where there's an opportunity to do more is definitely within the small business community. If you look at LA County alone, where 93% of businesses have less than 20 employees, and many of them are tenants in these buildings, what's important for them? It's things like watching their operating costs. So I heard some of you speak about energy efficiencies. All those things are very important to small businesses. I heard you speak about the health and wellness. That is top of mind right now, because smaller employers are going to have to bring back their workforce into buildings, and they need to ensure that their workforce is safe, that there's good ventilation systems and things of that nature. So those are the areas where I think there's greater opportunity, or we have the greatest opportunity to really educate the small businesses. Our own membership is about 68% small businesses, which are under 100 employees. And many times they don't have the infrastructure within their organizations to have an ESG department or some other department that monitors this. And this is, I think, where organizations like the LA Chamber can play a role in amplifying the issues that you're talking about today. I mean, this is really great information, and I look forward to, doing more in this area to help our small business community.
Well, Maria, I'm so glad you said that, because it really shows, and I hope that this episode and this panel discussion in particular have shown that the capability of measuring and improving resilience is there. There are design professionals like Elaine and Gail and Gensler, and structural engineers. There are contractors like Optimum Seismic that are willing and able and doing resilient design now. And there is a demand for contributing more business-wise for businesses to contribute to community resilience. And sometimes what it just takes is getting people together in forums like this, like the Resilience Advantage series, to let everybody know that, wow, this is possible. This is not something that, is just aspirational 20 years from now. So I'll use that as we conclude our conversation today to encourage all of our listeners and viewers today to help support the work that the U.S. Resiliency Council is doing. We're a nonprofit organization, and we would love to have your support, your membership. There are many opportunities to join the U.S. Resiliency Council, to contribute to the kind of work that we're doing and bringing these different groups together so that resilience and sustainability becomes more than just something that we aspire to, but is something that is actually happening. So please do consider joining our organization and helping contribute. I certainly would love to thank all of our panelists. Let me start first again by thanking Ali Zahabi and Optimum Seismic for sponsoring this. It's an incredible amount of work to make these happen every month, and Ali's support is essential, as is all of his staff. I'd like to thank BenStapleton and Elaine I and Emily Mazzacaretti and Gail Napel for joining us on this panel, for contributing their expertise to helping us understand how resilience is achievable. Really a special thank you to Maria, though. The LA Chamber, again, is such an important player because I learned in visiting with her last October that it isn't just all businesses. In fact, it's a majority of small business folks. And these are the folks that don't necessarily have the means to commission large studies on their own, but the work that Gail and Elaine are doing and the USGBCLA are doing can help bring those tools to be more accessible to many of her members. I definitely need to give a great thank you to Los Angeles Mayor Eric Garcetti and his Chief Resilience Officer, Aaron Gross, for supporting what we do, for creating that great video for us today. The support of cities and communities, both large like Los Angeles and very small, are really essential to bringing resilience to everyone. Our promotional partners, as Maria mentioned, LA BizFed, LA Economic Development Council, the LA Area Chamber of Commerce, of course, and our other supporters like EERI and the Culver City Chamber of Commerce have all been essential in really helping us promote this. So with that, I want to thank you all, panelists and attendees in particular, for attending this episode of the Resilience Advantage. Next month, we're going to talk about science and technology, but we're not going to talk about it in an engineering way. Don't be afraid to attend. We really hope you will, because what it's going to show is, just like we talked today, just like Elaine and Gail talked today, the kinds of interesting technologies that are being used to make buildings more resilient are very accessible. They're being used on projects large and small. And so they can be used by everyone. So I'll help you, will join us for that. We're also going to be learning about how the next generation of structural engineers at universities around the state have been growing their desire and their study of resilience. So thank you once again to everybody, and enjoy the rest of your day.